The first thing my brother said to me that morning was not hello. It was, "You don't need all that money sitting there." He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, like he hadn't just reached across the table and placed his hand on something that had taken me 10 years to build. I remember the clink of his coffee spoon against the mug. I remember the way my mother kept her eyes on her plate, carefully rearranging scrambled eggs that were already cold. I remember how quiet the house felt for a place that used to be loud. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be a small conversation. My name is Rachel Monroe. I was 32 at the time. I lived alone in a modest townhouse outside of Columbus, Ohio, close enough to family to be convenient, far enough to feel independent. I worked as a compliance manager for a healthcare company, the kind of job no one brags about, but everyone needs. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't reckless. I was careful in a way people only notice when it inconveniences them. What my brother was referring to was my savings. Not just a checking account balance. Not spending money. He meant my long-term accounts, the ones I didn't talk about, the ones I had built quietly contribution by contribution, while everyone else assumed I would always be fine. I looked up at him and waited. Silence has always been my way of finding out how serious someone is. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms like he was settling into a story he'd rehearsed. "I'm just saying," he continued, "you're not married, no kids, good job. That money could actually do something right now." Across the table, my mother cleared her throat. My father folded his newspaper without looking up. This wasn't just my brother talking. This was a family conversation wearing his voice. The reason I was there at all was supposed to be simple. Sunday breakfast, a tradition we'd kept since childhood. No agenda, no pressure. Except lately, nothing with my family came without strings. My brother Evan was in the middle of building something, which was his way of saying he was chasing a business idea that sounded impressive, but never quite produced results. This time it involved a partnership, a short window, and a promise of returns that were always just out of reach. I had heard pieces of it before, over holidays, in passing, carefully edited versions meant to sound stable. This was the first time my name had been pulled directly into it. "I don't have money sitting there," I said evenly. "It's allocated." Evan smiled the way he always did when he thought I was being dramatic. "You always say that," because it was always true. He started talking about timing, about opportunity, about how banks were slow and didn't understand the potential, about how families should help each other get ahead instead of letting strangers profit. I noticed the pattern immediately. He never said the word loan. He never said repay. He never said risk. He said help. My father finally looked up. "Your brother's trying to make something of himself," he said, like that explained everything. "It's not like he's asking for charity." I asked how much he needed. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. My mother exhaled too loudly. Evan named the number, spoken cleanly, precisely. A number that made my stomach tighten, not because I couldn't afford it on paper, but because I knew exactly what it would cost in reality. I didn't react, I didn't argue, I didn't laugh. I asked one question: why me? No one answered right away. Finally, my mother said, "You're the responsible one." That sentence followed me for the rest of the year. Being responsible had always been my role. I paid my own way through college. I worked full-time while studying for certifications. I skipped vacations. I drove cars longer than necessary. I made choices that didn't look impressive but felt secure. And because I never needed rescuing, my resources were seen as available. Evan talked faster now, sensing resistance. He said this was temporary. He said he'd pay me back once things stabilized. He said I was making it bigger than it needed to be. My father nodded along. Family doesn't nickel and dime each other. I watched my mother's hands twist in her lap. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. That's when I realized something important. This conversation didn't start that morning. It had been happening without me for weeks. They already knew my answer. They just expected it to change. "I'm not doing this," I said. The words landed softly. No drama, no heat. Evan's smile vanished. "You haven't even heard the full plan." "I've heard enough." My father's voice hardened. "You're being selfish." There it was, the word that always comes out when boundaries show up uninvited. I stood, pushed my chair in, and thanked my mother for breakfast. My hands were steady even though my chest felt hollow. No one stopped me. No one followed. As I drove home, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror, a single thought kept circling in my mind. If saying no to this made me selfish, What did that say about what they were asking me to give up? That night, my phone lit up with messages. Not questions, statements. Guilt wrapped in concern. Warnings about regret. Reminders of everything my parents had done for me. I didn't respond. Because somewhere between the coffee spoon clinking against the mug and my brother naming that number, something had cracked open. And I could feel it already. This wasn't about money. It was about control. The silence after I left my parents' house didn't last long. It never does when you refuse to play the role everyone assigned you. By Monday morning, it had turned into noise. I woke up before my alarm the same way I always did on workdays. The light outside my bedroom window was thin and gray, the kind that makes everything feel unfinished. For a few seconds, my mind was empty. Then my phone face down on the nightstand seemed to hum with weight. I didn't touch it yet. Routine has always been my anchor. When things start to tilt, I rely on structure, the way other people rely on reassurance. Shower, coffee, toast, same mug, same chair at the counter. I went through the motions carefully, deliberately, as if keeping my body steady might keep my thoughts from racing. It didn't. By the time I poured my coffee, I could already feel it. That familiar pressure building behind my ribs. Not panic, expectation. The kind that comes when you know someone is about to demand something and call it love. My phone lit up while I was tying my shoes. Mom. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice sounded tight, like she had been holding it together for a while and was hoping I would make it easier. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention breakfast. She went straight into it. Your father didn't sleep, she said. Evan's really upset. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. About what? She exhaled sharply, the way she always did when she thought I was being difficult on purpose. You know what? I did. I just needed to hear her say it. She told me Evan felt blindsided. That he had already told his partner I was on board. That pulling out now made him look unreliable. She said my father felt disrespected. That he couldn't believe I would refuse family when it mattered. I waited until she finished. I didn't agree to anything I said, so I didn't pull out. There was a pause on the line. Then her tone shifted softer, more practiced. Rachel, you've always been good with money. You'll recover. Evan doesn't have the same head for it. He needs help. There it was again, the framing. My competence turned into an obligation. His recklessness turned into need. I told her calmly that the money they were talking about wasn't extra. That it was invested. That pulling it out early would come with penalties and long-term loss. I explained it the same way I would explain it to a coworker who didn't understand a regulation. She listened just long enough to reply, money comes back, family doesn't. I had heard that phrase my entire life. It had always sounded warm before. That morning it sounded like a threat. When we hung up, I sat in my car in the driveway for a moment longer than usual, hands resting on the steering wheel. The neighborhood was quiet. A man down the street was loading a ladder into his truck. Someone walked a dog past my driveway, nodding politely. The world looked normal. That was the part that unsettled me the most. At work, I buried myself in emails and reports. Numbers were obedient. Policies were clear. If something didn't work, there was a reason written down somewhere. No one accused you of betrayal for following rules. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. Evan this time. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. His voice was different than it had been at breakfast. Sharper, less charming. He said I was putting him in a bad position. He said he didn't expect this from me. He said he thought I cared about the family more than a spreadsheet. That word stuck with me, spreadsheet. As if the years of planning behind those numbers were just rows and columns, not evenings spent saying no. Not choices made quietly without applause. I didn't call him back. Instead, I went out to my car and ate lunch alone. The engine was off. The windows were cracked. I watched people move through the parking lot, talking, laughing, complaining about small things that didn't follow them home. I thought about how often I had been described as low maintenance, independent, easy. What people really meant was I didn't ask for much, so they felt entitled to more. That afternoon, my Aunt Linda posted something online. She didn't mention my name, but she didn't have to. She wrote about how success can make people forget their roots. About how some people turn cold when family needs them most. The comments came quickly. Agreement, sad faces, moral certainty. I stared at my phone until the screen dimmed. By the time I got home, my chest felt tight in a way that wasn't panic, just pressure. Like something heavy had settled there and decided to stay. I reheated leftovers and ate standing at the counter. I didn't sit down. Sitting felt like stopping, and stopping felt dangerous. My phone buzzed again. A text from my father. He said we needed to talk. He said this wasn't how families behaved. He said I was creating distance that didn't need to exist. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Instead, I opened my laptop and logged into my financial accounts. Not because I was tempted, because I needed to see the truth without anyone else narrating it. The balances were exactly where they should be. Quiet, growing, stable. The result of consistency, not luck. I scrolled slowly, line by line, grounding myself in facts. This was my future, not abstract, not hypothetical. Mine. As I closed the laptop, something settled in my mind with surprising clarity. They weren't reacting this strongly because they needed help. They were reacting because I had broken an unspoken rule. I was supposed to say yes. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the faint sound of traffic outside, I thought about how quickly love had turned conditional, how easily concern had become pressure, how silence and guilt were being used as tools. I wasn't angry yet, but I was paying attention. And somewhere beneath the noise, I could feel it beginning. This was going to escalate. By the third day, the tone changed. The messages stopped asking and started assuming. It began with small things. Evan texting me links to articles about family businesses. My father forwarding opinion pieces about loyalty and sacrifice with a single line underneath, something to think about. My mother sending a photo from years ago, all of us smiling at a holiday table like nostalgia could soften consent. I didn't respond. Silence, I was learning, made people reckless. On Wednesday afternoon, Evan showed up at my townhouse without calling first. I saw his car from the kitchen window parked crookedly at the curb, like he hadn't bothered to line it up. My stomach tightened, but my hands stayed steady. I didn't rush. I finished rinsing my mug, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet before opening the door. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked in like he owned the place, like he had always assumed he would. "You're really doing this," he said, pacing my living room. "You're just going to sit there and let everything fall apart." I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms. "Nothing is falling apart because of me." He laughed, sharp and humorless. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one with people counting on you." I watched him move through my space, touching nothing but acting like it was already familiar territory. That was always Evan's way. Confidence without responsibility, motion without grounding. I asked him one question. "Why can't you get this through a bank?" He stopped pacing. "Because it complicates things," he said after a beat. "How?" He waved a hand. "Paperwork, time, questions that don't matter." They mattered to me. I waited. He sighed dramatically. "You're overthinking this. It's a short-term gap. Once the deal closes, everything loosens up." "What deal?" I asked. He hesitated just for a second. "It's an investment opportunity," he said finally. "You wouldn't get it?" That landed exactly the way he intended it to. As dismissal, as leverage. I straightened, "Then explain it to me." He didn't. Instead, he switched tactics. He talked about how our parents were aging, how stress wasn't good for Dad's blood pressure, how Mom cried after I left on Sunday. He said I'd regret this when it was too late. When he realized none of it was working, his voice hardened. "You've always thought you were better than us," he said. "This just proves it." I looked at him carefully then. Not the words, the posture, the deflection, the absence of specifics. That was the moment I understood something crucial. He wasn't trying to convince me. He was trying to wear me down. I told him calmly that he needed to leave. He stared at me shocked, like no one had ever said that to him before. Then he scoffed and walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. That night I changed my locks. Not because I thought Evan would come back, because the line had moved. The next morning I took a personal day from work, not to rest, to think. I drove to a quiet park near the river and sat on a bench with a notebook. I wrote down what I knew. Not feelings, facts. Evan needed a large sum of money quickly. He avoided banks. He avoided details. He framed urgency as inevitability. My parents backed him without understanding the risk or pretending not to. They believed my stability made me expendable. Seeing it written out stripped it of emotion. It also raised a question I couldn't ignore. How did my father know the exact amounts in my accounts? I hadn't told him. I hadn't told anyone. That afternoon, I called my financial advisor and asked a series of questions I had never thought to ask before. About account access, about beneficiaries, about whether anyone else could see balances without my consent. The answers were reassuring, mostly, but they also confirmed something uncomfortable. Years ago, when I was younger and less guarded, I had listed my parents as emergency contacts on several forms, not owners, not authorized users, but close enough to make assumptions feel justified. I updated everything. When I hung up, my phone buzzed, a message from my mother. She said Dad was considering pulling back support if I continued being difficult. She said she was worried about what this meant for the family long term. I read it twice. Support. I paid my own bills. I had for years. But the word was revealing. It meant something emotional, conditional, invisible until it was threatened. I replied with a single sentence. I'm not discussing money anymore. The response came almost immediately. You're making a mistake. That night my father called. His voice was controlled, measured, like he was negotiating something that belonged to him. He said Evan's opportunity was time-sensitive. He said hesitation kills momentum. He said he had raised me better than this. I let him talk. When he paused waiting for my defense, I said something he wasn't expecting. If this goes wrong, who absorbs the loss? Silence. I pressed gently. If the investment fails, if the money doesn't come back, who takes the hit? He cleared his throat. That's not how you should be thinking. But it was. I told him I wouldn't be withdrawing any funds, that my answer was final. That I loved them, but I wouldn't be pressured into risking my future. His voice dropped. Then don't expect things to stay the same. There it was. The threat finally spoken out loud. We ended the call without saying goodbye. I sat in the dark living room afterward, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I just sat there letting the truth settle. Love that disappears when you say no isn't love. It's leverage. And once you see it for what it is, you can't unsee it. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But I knew one thing. I wasn't the one losing control. They were. By Thursday, the pressure stopped pretending to be concern. It arrived dressed as certainty. My father called early that morning, earlier than he ever used to. I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen counter with my coffee, untouched, staring at nothing. When I saw his name on the screen, I didn't brace myself. I felt oddly detached, like I was watching something inevitable unfold. He didn't waste time. We've talked as a family, he said. We need clarity. That word again, clarity, as if I had been vague. I've been clear, I replied. He ignored that. Evan's opportunity won't wait. Everyone agrees this is the right move. Everyone. The collective voice they always used when they wanted to dissolve responsibility. No one owns the decision if everyone owns it. I asked him calmly if he understood what early withdrawal would cost me. Not just penalties, not just taxes, years of lost growth, years I could never recover. He sighed, irritated. You're thinking like an accountant, not like a daughter. That sentence landed harder than any accusation so far. I realized then that my role had never been to be a person with boundaries. It was to be a function, a resource, a solution. I told him no again. There was a pause, then his voice hardened in a way I had never heard directed at me before. If you choose to stand apart from the family on this, you should be prepared for consequences. He didn't specify what those were. He didn't have to. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, the coffee now cold in my hands. The house felt smaller, the air heavier, not because I was afraid, but because I could feel something tightening around me. Social pressure doesn't scream, it constricts. That afternoon, my Aunt Linda called. She went straight into it, her voice sharp with moral certainty. She told me people were talking, that my parents were embarrassed, that I was being selfish and ungrateful. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I thanked her for her concern and told her I wouldn't be discussing my finances with extended family. She hung up on me. An hour later, my cousin texted to ask if everything was okay. No accusations, no pressure, just a question. I didn't answer. By evening, the messages from Evan started again. Shorter now, less persuasive, more pointed. If this falls through, that's on you. You always think you're smarter than everyone else. I hope it's worth it. I read them without responding. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative shifted. I wasn't just refusing to help anymore. I was being positioned as the reason things were about to go wrong. It was subtle but deliberate. If the fallout came, it would have a name attached to it. Mine. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was panicking, but because my mind was working. Patterns forming, pieces aligning. Evan wasn't just asking for help. He was operating under a deadline that didn't match the story he was telling. My father wasn't just supporting him, he was enforcing compliance. My mother's silence wasn't confusion, it was alignment without confrontation. I realized something else too. They weren't worried about my refusal, they were worried about losing access. The next morning, I took another personal day. I didn't tell anyone why. I drove to a quiet office park on the other side of town and sat in my car for a few minutes before going inside. The building was plain beige, forgettable. Exactly the kind of place people overlook. Inside was a small law firm I had been referred to years ago by a colleague. I hadn't thought I'd ever need them personally. I asked to speak with an attorney about asset protection and family pressure. The woman who met with me was in her late 40s, calm, precise. She didn't react when I explained the situation. She didn't judge, she didn't sympathize. She listened. When I finished, she asked a simple question. Has anyone threatened legal action? No, I said. Not yet, she replied. She walked me through scenarios I hadn't wanted to imagine. Informal loans with no documentation. Family members claiming implied agreements. Pressure escalating into coercion. Emotional leverage becoming something uglier when money is involved. She told me the most important thing I could do right now was create distance and documentation. Not to provoke, to protect. By the time I left her office, my chest felt tight, but my mind was clear. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. That afternoon, I made changes. I updated beneficiaries. I added additional authentication to my accounts. I documented conversations, dates, phrases, not emotions, facts. Each step felt strangely grounding. When you're being pushed, movement restores balance. That evening, my mother finally called. Her voice was tired, not angry, not pleading, just resigned. She said she didn't recognize this version of me. She said she felt like she was losing her daughter. I listened. Then I told her quietly that I felt like I had already been lost the moment my no stopped being acceptable. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she asked if there was anything that could change my mind. No, I said. The silence stretched between us. When she spoke again, her voice was flat. Then I don't know where this leaves us. After we hung up, I sat alone in my living room, the lights off the city outside glowing faintly through the windows. I felt a deep, unfamiliar sadness. Not grief, recognition. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a power struggle, and the only way it ended was with someone losing. They believed it would be me. They were wrong. The ultimatum arrived the following morning. Not dramatic, not shouted. Delivered the way my family always delivered control when they believed they were being reasonable. My father sent a text. We can't keep waiting. We need an answer by the end of the week. No greeting, no context, just a deadline like my life was an agenda item. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Not because I was unsure, but because something in me finally shifted from defense to assessment. Deadlines only matter if you accept the authority behind them, and I no longer did. I didn't reply. Instead, I went to work. That day, everything felt slightly off, like the world had tilted a few degrees and I was the only one who noticed. Meetings blurred together. Voices sounded distant. I caught myself rereading the same email 3 times without absorbing it. Not from distraction, but from a growing awareness that something bigger was unfolding beneath the surface. At lunch, I sat alone in my car again. This time I didn't scroll. I didn't listen to music. I thought. Evan's urgency didn't make sense for a normal business opportunity. Neither did his avoidance of banks. Neither did my father's sudden confidence about numbers he shouldn't have known. And my mother's silence felt less like neutrality and more like consent. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I called a former colleague. Her name was Melissa. We had worked together years ago before she moved into risk assessment consulting. We hadn't spoken in a while, but our relationship had always been straightforward, professional, honest. I told her I needed a sanity check. I kept it vague. Family pressure, a large sum of money, an investment that needed to move fast. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she asked one question. Have you seen the actual paperwork? No, I said. Then you don't have an investment, she replied. You have a story. She explained something I already knew intellectually, but hadn't allowed myself to fully register emotionally. Real opportunities come with transparency. They invite scrutiny. They survive questions. Anything that collapses under inspection isn't fragile. It's flawed. She asked if I wanted her to look at anything if it became available. I said yes. That evening, Evan called again. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, his voice tight-clipped, stripped of pretense. "This is your last chance to be part of this," he said. "After that, don't expect us to forget." That word again, forget, as if memory was something he controlled. I saved the voicemail. The next day, my father called while I was at work. I let it go to voicemail. Then my mother. Then my Aunt Linda again. The sequence itself told a story. Pressure layered, escalating, coordinated. That night, something unexpected happened. Evan emailed me. Not a text, not a call, an email with an attachment. The subject line read, "So you understand." My pulse picked up as I opened it. Inside was a single document, poorly formatted, no letterhead, no signatures. A vague outline of projected returns and timelines that leaned heavily on words like anticipated, expected, positioned to benefit. I read it twice, then a third time. There was no mention of risk, no contingency planning, no clear explanation of where the money would actually go. It referenced partners without naming them, markets without specifying them, gains without defining how they would be achieved. It wasn't a plan, it was a pitch, and not a good one. What caught my attention most, though, was the amount listed at the bottom. The exact figure Evan had named at breakfast, the exact amount my father had repeated without hesitation. That wasn't coincidence. I forwarded the document to Melissa. She called me less than 10 minutes later. "Rachel," she said slowly, "this isn't just risky." "What is it?" I asked. "It's incomplete," she replied, "and incomplete on purpose." She explained that the language was designed to obscure liability. That if something went wrong, the person providing the funds would have no leverage, no claim, no protection. That whoever structured this had made sure the downside landed in exactly one place. On the person supplying the cash. Me. I felt something cold settle in my chest, not fear, recognition. They hadn't just assumed I would say yes. They had structured everything around it. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed conversations with new ears. Evan's insistence that I didn't need to understand the details. My father's dismissal of risk. My mother's emphasis on unity over clarity. Linda's public shaming. It all lined up. I wasn't being asked to help. I was being positioned as a buffer. The next morning, I called the attorney again. I told her I had seen documentation. I told her it confirmed my concerns. She didn't sound surprised. She asked me to email everything, the voicemail, the text, the document. When she called back later, her voice was firm. "You're not just dealing with emotional pressure," she said. "You're dealing with attempted financial coercion." The word landed heavy. She advised me to stop engaging altogether. No more explanations, no more defenses. Silence creates a record when pressure continues, and pressure, she reminded me, has a way of exposing intent. That afternoon, my father sent another message. "Your mother is devastated. I hope you can live with that." I stared at it, then closed my phone. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel cornered. I felt clear. They had crossed from expectation into entitlement, from persuasion into threat. From family disagreement into something transactional and dangerous. And I finally understood the truth I had been circling for days. This wasn't going to end with a conversation. It was going to end with an action. The silence after I stopped responding didn't calm anything down. It sharpened it. By the weekend, the messages changed again. Shorter, more deliberate. No explanations, no justifications. Just pressure wrapped in implication. My father texted once more. "We raised you better than this." Evan followed an hour later. "You're really going to do this to us?" Neither message asked a question. They were statements meant to provoke guilt, not dialogue. I didn't answer. That Sunday, I didn't go to my parents' house for breakfast for the first time in years. I stayed home. I cleaned. I organized files I had been meaning to sort through. I moved slowly, deliberately grounding myself in physical tasks, while my mind stayed alert. Around noon, there was a knock at my door. I didn't open it right away. I checked the camera first. My parents' car sat at the curb. My stomach tightened, but my resolve didn't waver. I opened the door just enough to stand in the frame, not inviting them in. My mother's face looked strained. My father's expression was controlled, almost rehearsed. Evan stood slightly behind them, arms crossed, jaw set. "We need to talk," my father said. "I've been clear," I replied. He stepped forward as if to enter. I didn't move. "This isn't how families handle disagreements," he said. "This isn't a disagreement," I said calmly. "It's pressure." Evan scoffed. "You're exaggerating." I looked directly at him. "Then explain why you avoid banks. Explain why the paperwork you sent me leaves all risk with me. Explain why everyone knows my account balances." The air shifted. My mother's eyes flicked toward my father. Evan's jaw tightened. No one answered. That silence told me more than words ever could. You don't trust us, my mother asked, her voice thin. I don't trust this situation, I said. And I don't trust the way my no is being handled. My father's voice hardened. If you walk away from this, don't expect things to stay the same. There it was again, the threat dressed as consequence. I nodded. I understand. They stood there for a moment longer, waiting. For tears, for hesitation, for me to back down. I didn't. Finally, my father turned away. Evan followed without looking at me. My mother lingered for a second, like she wanted to say something else, then she left too. I locked the door behind them. That night I sent one email, not to my family, to the attorney. I told her they had shown up unannounced. I told her about the conversation. I told her the pressure was escalating. She responded quickly. We should formalize boundaries, she wrote, and prepare for retaliation. Retaliation. Another word that settled heavy but felt accurate. The next day I received an email from my father's address. The subject line read, "Moving forward." Inside, he outlined what he called expectations. That family resources should support family growth. That refusal would be interpreted as withdrawal. That decisions have consequences. It read less like a message and more like a policy statement. I forwarded it to my attorney. She called me within the hour. "This is good," she said. I frowned. How? "Because it establishes intent," she replied. "And because it confirms this isn't about help, it's about compliance." She advised me to send a single response, short, factual, non-emotional. She helped me draft it. I didn't explain my reasoning. I didn't justify my decision. I didn't argue. I stated that I would not be providing funds, that I did not consent to further discussion about my finances, that any continued pressure should be directed through legal counsel. Then I sent it. The reaction was immediate. My phone rang within minutes. I didn't answer. Evan left a voicemail, furious now. He accused me of escalating things, of turning family into a legal issue, of being cold and calculating. I saved it. My mother texted begging me to reconsider, saying this was tearing everyone apart. I didn't reply. By the end of the week, something else happened. A rumor reached me through a coworker who happened to know a friend of Evan's. Casual conversation, nothing official. She mentioned almost offhand that Evan's big opportunity wasn't just an investment. It was a leveraged play. Debt stacked on debt, personal guarantees, aggressive timelines, a structure that only worked if everything went perfectly. And if it didn't, whoever supplied the liquidity would take the fall. I sat in my car after work, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. They hadn't just wanted my money, they had needed it. And when they realized they couldn't get it quietly, they tried to take it through pressure instead. That was the moment something inside me finally hardened, not into anger, into resolve. I wasn't just going to say no anymore. I was going to make sure they could never try this again. The following Monday, I took another personal day. I went back to the law office. This time we talked about more than protection. We talked about separation, cease and desist options, documentation strategies, what it meant to formally cut off financial entanglement with family members who refused to respect boundaries. The attorney asked me if I was prepared for what that would mean emotionally. I answered honestly. I already lost them the moment I said no. She nodded. Then she slid a document across the table, a formal notice, clear, polite, unambiguous. It stated that any further attempts to pressure me financially would be considered harassment, that all communication regarding money should cease immediately, that my assets were not available for use, discussion, or negotiation. I read it carefully. Then I signed it. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Not because I doubted myself, but because I understood the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. When I left the office that afternoon, the air felt different. Lighter, sharper. Like a storm had finally broken instead of hovering overhead. I didn't know how my family would respond, but for the first time since this began, I wasn't waiting to find out. The letter went out on a Tuesday. Certified, documented, unemotional. By Wednesday morning, everyone knew. My phone didn't ring right away. That surprised me. I had braced for outrage, for a flood of messages, for some dramatic confrontation that would confirm I had done the right thing. Instead, there was nothing. No calls, no texts, no social media posts from Linda, no guilt-soaked messages from my mother. Just quiet. Silence can feel like relief or like the moment before impact. This felt like the second one. At work, I moved through the day with practiced calm. I answered emails. I joined meetings. I spoke when it was my turn. But underneath it all, I felt alert, like my body was waiting for something it knew was coming. It arrived that evening, not from my parents. From Evan. He didn't call my phone, he called my work line. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail anyway, his voice low-controlled in a way that suggested effort. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "You didn't have to make it formal." I listened to it once, then again. He wasn't angry. He was worried. That was new. The next day, my Aunt Linda posted again, this time not vague. She wrote about betrayal, about how some people hide behind lawyers when they don't want to face their own conscience, about how money changes people. I didn't respond, but I noticed something else. The comments were fewer. Some people asked questions. Some stayed silent. The certainty she'd relied on before wasn't there anymore. When narratives get too sharp, they start to cut the person holding them. That afternoon, I received an email from my father. Not a threat this time, a request. He asked if we could talk privately, just the two of us. No lawyers, no accusations, just father and daughter. I stared at the screen for a long time. A month ago, I would have agreed immediately. I would have driven over rehearsing explanations, preparing myself to be reasonable, to soften my words so no one felt attacked. That version of me was gone. I replied that I was open to a conversation, but only in writing. He didn't like that. His response came quickly. He accused me of hiding, of turning something simple into something ugly, of making it impossible to repair what I was breaking. I forwarded the exchange to my attorney. She replied with one sentence. Notice how repair only became important after access was removed. That sentence stayed with me. The following weekend, the fallout became visible. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years called to check on me. Her tone was cautious, curious. She said she'd heard things, conflicting things. I told her the truth, simply, without embellishment. I said my brother wanted me to finance a risky investment. I said my parents pressured me when I refused. I said I had chosen to protect myself. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "That doesn't sound like you did anything wrong." Word travels quietly when people are finally allowed to think. The real shift happened the next week. Evan's partner backed out. I didn't hear it directly. I heard it through layers. A friend of a friend, a comment overheard, a story that changed slightly every time it was told but kept the same core. The deal stalled. Deadlines passed. The opportunity everyone had insisted couldn't wait suddenly didn't exist anymore. And with it, the urgency evaporated. No more calls, no more deadlines, no more moral lectures, just absence. That's when my mother finally reached out. Her message was short, careful. She said things had been stressful, that everyone was hurting, that she wished things had gone differently. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the pressure. She didn't ask how I was. I replied politely, briefly. I said I hoped she was well. Nothing more. I was done offering explanations to people who used them as leverage. A few days later, my father sent one last message. He said he was disappointed in how everything had been handled. I read it once, then closed my phone. Disappointment had been his favorite tool for years. It had shaped my decisions more than I liked to admit. But now it felt distant, like an echo from a room I no longer lived in. That night, I sat alone in my living room with the lights off, watching the city glow through the windows. I thought about how close I had come to saying yes just to make the noise stop. How easily this could have ended with my future quietly unraveling, while everyone else insisted it had been necessary. I thought about how often women like me are praised for being strong until that strength is inconvenient. They don't ask you to break loudly, they ask you to bend quietly. The next morning, I did something small but symbolic. I updated my emergency contacts. I removed my parents' names. I replaced them with a friend who had shown up without expectations, without conditions. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. Whatever stories my family told themselves, whatever blame they assigned to make sense of losing control, none of it required my participation. I had drawn a line, and the most surprising part wasn't that they crossed it. It was that once it was there, I could finally see how far they'd been stepping into my life all along. The collapse didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic phone call, no public confession, no moment where someone admitted they'd been wrong. It happened the way most consequences do. Quietly, in pieces, passed along in half sentences and careful omissions. I didn't hear about it from my parents or from Evan. I heard about it from someone who had nothing to gain by shaping the story. A woman I worked with invited me to coffee after a meeting. We sat across from each other, cups between us, making small talk until she hesitated and said my brother's name like she wasn't sure she should. She told me she knew someone who had been involved in the same venture Evan was chasing, not directly, but close enough to recognize the structure. She said the entire thing had been built on borrowed time and borrowed money. That once one investor pulled out, the whole arrangement began to unravel. There were margin calls, there were penalties, there were deadlines no one could negotiate their way out of. By the time she finished, my coffee was cold. I didn't ask questions, I didn't need details. I knew enough to understand what had happened. The buffer was gone. Without my money, there was nothing left to absorb the impact. That evening, I went home and sat in my car for a long time before going inside. The street was quiet. Lights flickered on in windows one by one. Ordinary lives unfolding while something significant closed behind me. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, yes, but also distance. The kind that comes when you watch something you warned about finally arrive and realize there is nothing left to do. 2 days later, Evan called again. Not my work line this time. My personal phone. I stared at his name until it stopped ringing. He left a voicemail. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Not angry, not defensive. Tired. He said things had gone wrong. That he hadn't anticipated certain shifts. That partners had backed out unexpectedly. That timing had been brutal. He didn't say he was sorry. He said he needed help. I didn't respond. The next message came from my mother. She said Evan was under an enormous amount of stress, that my father was worried, that the family needed to come together now more than ever. There it was again. Not apology, expectation. I forwarded both messages to my attorney. She replied with a simple question. Are you prepared to reopen contact under pressure? I wasn't. That weekend I learned more. A cousin reached out, careful with her words. She told me Evan had taken out personal loans to keep things afloat, that my parents had co-signed something they barely understood, that the house they'd always spoken of as untouchable was suddenly very much on the table. I listened. I didn't comment. What struck me wasn't the scale of the loss. It was the speed. Everything they had framed as inevitable success collapsed the moment risk couldn't be transferred. That night I lay awake, replaying my father's words from weeks earlier. Family doesn't nickel and dime each other. He had been right about one thing. Family doesn't, but leverage does. The following Monday, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email. A physical envelope addressed in my father's handwriting. Inside was a single page. He wrote that they were facing financial difficulty, that they needed temporary assistance, that this was not about the past, but about survival. He said he hoped I could find it in my heart to reconsider. There was no mention of the threats, no acknowledgement of the pressure, no apology for telling me there would be consequences. Just need stripped of pretense. I held the letter for a long time, longer than I expected. Not because I was tempted, because I was grieving something I hadn't realized I'd lost. The belief that love would eventually override control. I placed the letter back in the envelope and locked it in a drawer. Not to preserve it, to remind myself. That night I drafted my response. Not emotional, not defensive. I told them I was sorry they were struggling. I told them I was unable to provide financial support. I told them I hoped they found solutions that did not require sacrificing someone else's stability. I read it twice, then I sent it through my attorney. The backlash was quieter this time. No public posts, no group messages, just absence. Days passed, then weeks. The noise that had once filled every corner of my life faded. In its place was something unfamiliar. Stillness. Not peace. Space. Space to think without bracing. Space to exist without being evaluated for usefulness. I realized something during those weeks. I wasn't waiting for them to understand me anymore. I was waiting for myself to fully accept that they never would. And once I did, something inside me settled. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. I stopped anticipating guilt. I stopped rehearsing explanations that would never be heard. The story had reached its turning point. They had gambled. They had lost. And for the first time, the cost was landing where it belonged. The quiet didn't last forever. It never does when people realize leverage has failed. The first sign came in the form of paperwork. A certified envelope arrived at my townhouse on a Tuesday afternoon. Plain. No return address I recognized. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and washed my hands, a small ritual I had developed when something felt off. Only then did I slide my finger under the flap. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was worse. A demand letter. Written by a small local attorney, aggressive in tone and thin on substance. It accused me of reneging on a family agreement. It implied I had verbally committed funds and caused financial harm by withdrawing support at a critical moment. It demanded a conversation to resolve the matter privately before further steps were taken. I read it twice, then a third time. There it was, the pivot I'd been expecting. When emotional pressure failed, they moved to intimidation, not because they had a case, but because they hoped fear would do what guilt no longer could. I felt my pulse quicken then settle. This was no longer personal. It was procedural. I scanned the letter and emailed it to my attorney. She called me less than an hour later. "They're bluffing," she said calmly, "but they've crossed a line." I asked her what my options were. She didn't hesitate. "We can respond, or we can escalate." I chose escalation, not out of anger, out of clarity. Over the next few days, we moved deliberately. My attorney drafted a formal response dismantling their claims point by point. No agreement, no consideration, no reliance, no damages. She cited the documented pressure, the threats, the attempted coercion. She made it clear that any further contact would be treated as harassment. Then she suggested something else: estate planning. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before. I was young, healthy, focused on the present, but she explained that uncertainty invites intrusion. That ambiguity creates opportunity for people who believe they are entitled to your future. We set an appointment. That Friday, I sat across from a different attorney, one who specialized in wills and trusts. The office was quiet, professional, unassuming. He asked me who I wanted to benefit if something happened to me. I didn't answer right away. For the first time, I allowed myself to say it out loud. "Not my family." He nodded without judgment. We went through the details: beneficiaries, healthcare directives, powers of attorney. I designated people who had shown up without demands, who respected my autonomy, who didn't view my life as a resource. When I signed the documents, my hand didn't shake. That surprised me. It felt like closing a door that had never truly been mine to keep open. The response from my family's attorney came a week later. Shorter, less confident. They withdrew the demand. No apology, no explanation, just a statement that they would not be pursuing the matter further at this time. At this time, I smiled when I read it. Not because I'd won, because they'd retreated. Word traveled after that, quietly, the way it always does when people realize the story they've been telling doesn't hold up under scrutiny. A cousin reached out to say she'd heard things weren't as simple as they'd seemed. A family friend sent a message asking how I was holding up carefully neutral, no accusations attached. I answered selectively, truthfully, without embellishment. I didn't defend myself, I didn't persuade, I let the facts exist on their own. They were enough. At work, something else shifted. My manager asked if I'd be interested in leading a new compliance initiative. It came with more responsibility, more visibility, more autonomy. I said yes without hesitation. Momentum has a way of returning when you stop carrying other people's weight. One evening as I was leaving the office, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. An old family acquaintance. She looked uncomfortable when she recognized me, like she wasn't sure which version of the story she was supposed to believe. She said I heard things got complicated. I smiled politely. They did. She hesitated, then added, "You know, not everyone thinks you are wrong." That was the moment I realized something important. I had assumed silence meant judgment. It often means observation. The last contact came unexpectedly. A voicemail from my father. His voice sounded older, quieter, less certain. He said things had gotten out of hand, that mistakes were made, that he wished we could go back to how things were. He didn't say he was sorry. He said he missed his daughter. I sat with that message for a long time. Then I deleted it. Not out of cruelty, out of honesty. How things were had never been what I thought they were. Going back would mean unseeing everything I now understood. That night, I stood in my living room looking around at the space I had made safe again. The walls felt solid. The air felt calm. My phone lay silent on the table, no longer a source of dread. I thought about the version of myself who would have folded, who would have signed the check, told herself it was temporary, absorbed the loss quietly while everyone else moved on. I thought about how close I came to that future, and I felt something unexpected. Gratitude, not for the betrayal, for the clarity it forced. Because sometimes the most effective revenge isn't exposure or confrontation. It's refusing to be the place where consequences land. The aftermath didn't look the way I had imagined it would. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful apology, no final confrontation where everything was laid bare and neatly resolved. Instead, there was distance, quiet, a slow, awkward reordering of reality that no one acknowledged out loud. In some ways, that was harder. Without conflict to react against, I was left alone with what had changed, with the absence of constant pressure, with the realization that I no longer had a role to play in my family's daily orbit. At first, that absence felt like standing in an empty room after furniture has been moved out. The echo surprised me. I kept expecting something to fill the space. A call, a demand, a sudden crisis that would pull me back into motion. It didn't come. Weeks passed, then more. The family group chat stayed silent. Holidays came and went without invitations or arguments. Birthdays were acknowledged with a single text, or not at all. The noise that had once defined my place among them faded into something faint and distant. And slowly something else took its place. Relief. Not the loud kind, not the triumphant kind people imagine when they think about cutting someone off. This was quieter. It showed up in small, unremarkable moments. In the way my shoulders no longer tensed when my phone buzzed. In the way I slept through the night without replaying conversations that hadn't happened yet. At work, the new initiative consumed me in a good way. It demanded focus, judgment, authority, the kind of responsibility that comes with trust rather than obligation. I led meetings, made decisions, signed off on policies that had real impact. No one questioned my right to do so. No one hinted that I owed them anything for the opportunity. That contrast stayed with me. One afternoon after a long meeting, my manager stopped me in the hallway. He said the project was exceeding expectations. He said leadership had noticed. He asked if I'd consider stepping into a broader role when the time came. I said yes. I didn't downplay it. I didn't ask if it was too much. I didn't wonder aloud whether I deserved it. I simply accepted. That night driving home, I realized something that startled me. I hadn't thought about Evan all day. Not with anger, not with worry, not with the dull ache of responsibility that had followed me for years. He hadn't crossed my mind at all. When I noticed, I felt a strange mix of guilt and freedom. The guilt was familiar, automatic. The freedom felt earned. The past still surfaced sometimes. A memory would rise unexpectedly. A childhood moment reinterpreted through a new lens. A time when I had stepped in quietly to fix something no one else wanted to handle. A time when being capable had made me invisible. I didn't push those thoughts away. I examined them. I saw patterns I hadn't allowed myself to name before. How praise had always followed sacrifice. How love had always come with conditions. How I had learned early that keeping the peace often meant abandoning myself. Seeing it clearly didn't make me bitter. It made me careful. One evening, a few months after the legal dust had settled, I ran into my mother at the grocery store. It was unexpected, ordinary, the kind of coincidence you can't prepare for. She looked older, tired, not dramatically so, just enough to notice. We stood there between shelves of canned soup and pasta, both of us unsure who should speak first. She did. She asked how I was. The question sounded genuine, tentative. I told her I was well. She nodded like she had expected that answer but didn't know what to do with it. She said things had been hard, that the family was adjusting. I listened. She didn't mention money, or lawyers, or threats. She didn't apologize, but she didn't accuse me either. Before we parted, she said something quiet. I didn't think it would end like this. I looked at her carefully, at the woman who had raised me to be responsible, accommodating, strong, at the woman who had gone silent when I needed her to speak. I didn't either, I said. And that was it. No embrace, no reconciliation, just an honest moment that acknowledged loss without pretending it could be undone. I walked away feeling steadier than I expected. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook open in front of me. Not because I needed to plan or protect or prepare, because I wanted to write. I wrote down the things I had learned, not as rules, as reminders. That urgency is often a cover for recklessness. That love doesn't demand self-destruction as proof. That being needed is not the same as being valued. That silence can be a boundary, not a failure. I realized something else as I wrote. My decision hadn't just protected my finances. It had changed how I saw myself. I no longer measured my worth by how much damage I could absorb. I no longer confused endurance with integrity. I no longer mistook obligation for connection. That shift felt permanent. The final message came months later. A simple email from my father. He said he hoped I was well. He said he was trying to move forward. He said he didn't want things to be strained forever. I read it once. Then I closed my laptop. Some doors don't need to be slammed. They just need to stay closed. I went to bed that night with a quiet certainty that surprised me. Not because everything had turned out perfectly, but because I had acted in alignment with myself when it mattered most. I had chosen dignity over approval. And nothing about that choice felt temporary. Time did what conflict never could. It clarified. A year passed without incident. Not because everything healed, but because everything settled into its true shape. Distance stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like structure. Something stable. Something intentional. My life became quieter in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not lonely, just unburdened. I moved to a different townhouse closer to work, smaller but brighter. I didn't tell my family beforehand. There was no reason to. The decision belonged to me, and for the first time that felt natural rather than defiant. I packed slowly, deliberately, letting go of things I'd carried out of habit rather than need. I noticed how little of my life actually required explanation. At work, the broader role materialized exactly as promised. More responsibility, more authority, more trust. I signed contracts, led teams, made decisions that affected real outcomes. No one questioned whether I was ready. No one implied I owed gratitude beyond competence. It felt clean. One afternoon during a quarterly review, a senior executive told me something that stayed with me. He said I had a steady presence, that I didn't react impulsively, that when things got tense I became clearer instead of louder. I thanked him and went back to my desk. I didn't tell him that steadiness had been earned the hard way. The family updates came less frequently now, and when they did, they arrived stripped of urgency. A cousin mentioned my parents had finally downsized. Another said Evan was working a regular job again, something stable, something quiet. Ryan was gone from the story entirely, as if he had evaporated once there was nothing left to extract. No one said the word failure, but it hovered there unspoken. I thought I would feel satisfaction when I heard these things. I didn't. What I felt was distance. Emotional distance that allowed compassion without involvement, concern without responsibility. That distinction changed everything. The moment that surprised me most came during a routine meeting with my financial advisor. We were reviewing projections, long-term plans, the quiet accumulation of choices made consistently. She smiled and said, "You're in a strong position." I nodded, but something else registered beneath her words. I wasn't just financially secure. I was unentangled. No co-signed obligations, no implied debts, no invisible expectations hanging over my future. My plans were mine alone. Not resources to be negotiated, not leverage to be applied. After the meeting, I sat in my car and let that sink in. Unentangled. It felt like a word I should have learned much earlier. That winter, I received a handwritten card from my mother. It arrived unexpectedly, tucked between utility bills and advertisements. The handwriting was familiar, careful, almost formal. She wrote about the weather, about a neighbor, about a recipe she'd tried and ruined. Ordinary things. At the end, she wrote that she hoped I was happy. Not successful, not thriving. Happy. I read it twice. Then I put it in a drawer and didn't respond. Not because I was angry, because responding would have reopened something I wasn't willing to renegotiate. That was another lesson time taught me. Not every olive branch is meant to rebuild the same bridge. Some are just acknowledgments that the crossing is over. I thought about how much energy I used to spend anticipating emotional shifts, monitoring moods, adjusting myself to keep things smooth. I hadn't realized how constant that effort was until it disappeared. Now, when something felt wrong, I addressed it directly or stepped away. I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I stopped volunteering my stability as a solution. That shift showed up in unexpected places, in friendships, in work, in how I handled conflict. When someone pushed, I didn't retreat or overcompensate. I paused. And that pause changed the outcome more often than not. One evening, as I was organizing old files, I came across the folder I'd created during the worst of it. Screenshots, voicemails, letters, documentation I had needed to protect myself. I considered deleting it, then I didn't. Not because I wanted to hold on to resentment, but because I wanted to remember. Memory, I realized, isn't bitterness. It's context. The final interaction came quietly, almost anticlimactic. A message from Evan, short, careful, uncertain. He said he hoped I was doing well, that things hadn't gone the way he'd expected, that he'd learned some hard lessons. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask to meet. He asked if I'd ever want to talk. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied with one sentence. I hope you're okay. I didn't agree to talk. I didn't reject him either. I chose neutrality. And in that choice, I felt something settle completely. I no longer needed distance to protect myself. I had boundaries. There is a difference. That night, I stood by my window and looked out at the city lights. I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of all this. The one who believed love was something you proved by absorbing discomfort quietly. The one who thought saying no required justification. I felt a deep, unexpected gratitude toward her. Not because she had known better, but because she had learned. The story wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about refusing to disappear so others could remain comfortable. And in that refusal, I hadn't lost my family. I had found myself. The last thing to change was the way the story lived inside me, not the facts. Those had settled long ago. What shifted was the tone, the emotional weight, the quiet assumptions I used to carry without realizing it. For a long time, I thought the hardest part had been saying no, or standing my ground, or signing legal papers that drew a line my family refused to see. I was wrong. The hardest part was letting go of the hope that one day they would understand why I had to do it. That hope lingered longer than anger ever did. It showed up in small, uninvited moments. When I passed a family restaurant we used to go to, when I heard a song my mother liked, when I saw siblings laughing together in a grocery store aisle. It wasn't longing exactly. It was a reflex, a quiet habit of imagining how things might have been different if I had explained myself better, waited longer, softened more. One night, months after everything had settled, I realized something important. I had been trying to earn retroactive permission. Permission to protect myself. Permission to choose stability over approval. Permission to stop being useful at my own expense. The truth was, I never needed it. The morning that realization arrived, it didn't feel dramatic. I was standing at my kitchen counter, coffee steaming in front of me, sunlight spilling across the floor of my townhouse. Nothing was wrong, nothing was urgent. My phone was quiet. And for the first time, that quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like ownership. I thought back to the beginning, to the breakfast table, to the casual way my brother had talked about my money like it was idle waiting for direction, to the way my father had spoken with certainty about a future he assumed I would finance, to my mother's silence, heavy and instructive. I finally saw it clearly. They weren't confused by my no. They were offended by it, because my refusal didn't just block their plan. It challenged a system that had worked for them for years. A system where my competence absorbed risk, where my stability cushioned consequences, where my silence made things easier. The moment I stepped out of that system, everything that followed was inevitable. The pressure, the threats, the guilt, the attempt to reframe my boundaries as betrayal, and eventually the collapse, not because I caused it, because it had always been unstable. I had just stopped holding it up. What surprised me most in the end was how ordinary my life became once the crisis passed. I went to work. I paid my bills. I made plans based on what I wanted, not what I was expected to provide. I formed relationships where generosity flowed both ways, not just outward from me. I learned how to rest without feeling like I was neglecting someone. That might sound small. It wasn't. It was everything. One afternoon, during a quiet walk through my neighborhood, I passed a woman sitting on her front steps, talking on the phone. Her voice was tight, apologetic, rushed. She kept saying, "I'll figure it out. I always do." I stopped walking. That sentence hit me harder than anything my family had ever said. Because I recognized it, I had built my entire identity around being the person who figures it out. The one who smooths things over. The one who takes responsibility for outcomes she didn't create. That version of me wasn't weak. She was capable, but she was also vulnerable in a way no one had protected. I whispered something quietly to myself that day, something I wish I had learned sooner. Being capable does not mean being available for exploitation. That understanding changed how I moved through the world. I stopped volunteering information about my finances. I stopped over-explaining my decisions. I stopped confusing transparency with safety. When people asked questions that felt invasive, I didn't rush to reassure them. I answered what was necessary, and nothing more. The final closure didn't come from my family. It came from consistency, from watching my life remain intact while theirs adjusted to the consequences they had tried to pass on to me. From seeing that nothing terrible happened because I chose myself. From realizing that the fear I had carried for so long had been inherited, not earned. I don't hate my family. That surprises some people when they hear my story. Hatred would mean they still occupy emotional space they no longer deserve. What I feel instead is clarity. Clarity about who I am. Clarity about what I owe. Clarity about the difference between love and control. I did not destroy my family. I did not ruin anyone's life. I did not act out of revenge. I simply refused to let my future be used as collateral for someone else's gamble. And in doing that, I reclaimed something far more valuable than money. I reclaimed my agency. If you are listening to this and carrying your own version of this story, I want you to hear one thing clearly. You are not selfish for protecting what you built. You are not cruel for refusing to bankroll chaos. You are not disloyal for stepping away from people who confuse access with entitlement. Boundaries are not punishments. They are declarations of reality. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't exposure or confrontation. It's stability. It's living well without the people who needed you, small, compliant, and silent. It's choosing peace over permission. And if that choice costs you conditional love, understand this. What you lose was never unconditional to begin with. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived a version of it yourself, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from and what integrity means to you now. And if you want more stories like this, stories about boundaries, justice, and the quiet power of choosing yourself, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay with me. Because sometimes the most important story you hear is the one that reminds you you're allowed to walk away.